So our saint for this morning is Sarah Crosby. And we'll learn about Sarah through my sermon today. And Sarah is a United Methodist saint. You know, I have been your pastor now for about 2.5 years. I was just telling someone this morning that it seems much longer than that, and in a good way, really. But you know, this COVID thing has really thrown us for our whole sense of time. But I've been here for 2.5 years. I've been preaching to you for 2.5 years, and today is the third time that I have preached from Peter's outlandish dream, or trance, as this translation says. Now, I know it seems way too many times to focus on one story, but this dream opens up so much for us today as we look at Sarah Crosby and what she has to teach us about being stewards of our resources. This gospel reading, as you heard, is a dramatic story. This dream is a dramatic dream. It startled Peter and apparently all who learned of it. It's a story that reminds us that the Spirit of God sometimes will do something extraordinary to shake us from our not so great expectations on how we do life. These extraordinary meetings with God will help us see where our beliefs are limiting, even prohibiting others from experiencing abundant life. They will help us see, as Mark Schumacher, our trustee president, says, they'll help us see stinking thinking that we need to get rid of. And because of this dream, Peter's religious thinking was challenged. Because of this vision from God, Peter is led to break the long-held religious rules against baptizing folks who are not Jewish and break the rule of dining with those who are not like them. Peter's change of heart, his change of actions, did not go unnoticed. Fellow believers confronted him on this. They challenged him. Why are you going against the law? Why are you baptizing folks who are not like us and eating at their tables? Peter, although known to have said crazy things while Jesus was alive, was pretty much of a rule follower. Yes, he followed Jesus. Yes, he knew about Jesus' radical love, but he would still follow the rules. You know, he did not want to break the traditional rules that were straight from Deuteronomy and Leviticus, rules that if were broken, so they were told, were thought to be sin. I want to remind you that those rules were given for health and wellness for that period of time. And tragically, they became barriers to grace, barriers for many to experience grace. And from my own experience, the person who does all they can to regulate those laws, those barriers, those who have become gatekeepers of such laws, end up not experiencing grace for themselves. Peter saw this large tablecloth of food or animals before him 3 times. And 3 times he was asked to partake. Well, he was asked to kill and prepare and then eat the food. Food that was known to Peter and other Jewish followers of Jesus to be unclean and profane. Now, today, you and I, when we would see these foods, we would roll our eyes and think, really, what is wrong with pork, except if the cook isn't careful and it becomes dry? And maybe you would think, well, dang, lobster, that lobster truck that comes through our neighborhoods, what's wrong with that? This startling vision, though it was amazing, but it was also timely. It prepared Peter to welcome the Gentile folks who were knocking at his door at that time. He could come to them and hear what they had to say. And to make a long story short, Peter does go with these folks back to their home in Caesarea, where he baptizes a household of people who were then filled with the Holy Spirit. I like this one line in verse 12. Peter says, "The Spirit told me to go with them, to go with the non-Jewish folks, the people who weren't like him, and to not make a distinction between them and us." That's a bonus point there. I'm not going to expel on that, but I want you to think about that, how we often compare ourselves to those who aren't like us. And here Peter is being told, don't compare yourself with the Gentiles. Peter was given an extraordinary vision and an extraordinary opportunity that was a turning point, an experience that led to this newly developing church to open the circle wider, to build a longer table, if you will, and thus grace was not kept for just those groups of people, but expanded throughout the world. Maybe you have had a turning point experience that enabled you to make a change in your life, to move you into another direction, perhaps, that you had planned, or to embrace yourself more fully. Maybe it wasn't as extraordinary as Peter's, but it was one that shook up your preconceived notions, and when you took the risk to follow that calling, you experienced a freshness to life. And others experienced it too. It was a rippling effect. And yes, there may have been folks who doubted the choice that you then made and even challenged you on it. There will always be challengers. But oh, the freedom to do what is necessary, to do what is right, to do what is loving. Sarah Crosby, this week's saint, was inspired by a personal experience, a life-changing moment that led her to take a risk. Sarah was born October 6, 1729, in Leeds, England. As a young child, she enjoyed singing and dancing and playing cards, and then she began to attend an Anglican services when she was 14. In her late teens, she experienced a serious illness that triggered her to have a deep fear of dying. And as a result, she devoted herself even more to her faith. When she was 21, she married a Mr. Crosby. It's thought that her husband introduced her to John Wesley's writings before they married. Now, I think most of you may know about John Wesley. Let me quickly say that John Wesley was a clergy person, a priest in the Church of England, the Anglican Church. But John felt there was more to one's faith than coming on a Sunday morning for worship, so John started classes for those who were seeking more in their faith. We would call these discipleship classes or spiritual formation classes. And he also worked with the poor. These classes and his work with the poor provoked the Church of England to remove him from the church, to remove him as a priest. And so then it led him to start his own society, as he called it. So Sarah was impressed with Wesley's writings, and she sought out an opportunity to meet with Wesley, to hear him preach. And then she became a member of the Founders Methodist Society. Soon, Sarah joined a couple other women leading Methodist classes, like a Bible study that was accountability and spiritual support. Soon after becoming a class leader, Crosby experienced a vision. Jesus came to her and said, "Feed my sheep." Sarah says that this happened 3 times, and she felt deep in her heart that this meant God was calling her to preach. But it would be years before Sarah would actually preach. Women were not permitted to preach in 1752. Sarah continued then to lead classes and care for orphans and care for the poor. Her husband left her after 7 years of marriage, and so Sarah joined a Methodist class teacher, Mary, to assist the poor and disabled. It was during a mission quest where Mary was asked and actually instructed to lead classes to newly converted folks that she had a chance to step into her calling. The first class went really well in this new area of England. It was less than 30 attendees, but the following Sunday, there were over 200 that came to her class. Well, with this many people, it was pretty hard to have, the whole dynamics of the room changed, and so it was pretty hard to have this individual guidance time. And so she decided she was going to preach. She read a hymn, prayed, and told a story of how God had impacted her life. And then the next day, the crowd was larger, and so she preached again. And then she decided she better consult John Wesley, who was very tentative about allowing her to preach because it was generally thought of women were not allowed to do that. Sarah did what was necessary. And it was almost 10 years after her dream. Her calling to preach that day was a chance for her to fulfill her call, but it was also the opportunity for hundreds of people to experience God's grace through her preaching. And yes, she had, and John Wesley had, lots of pushback. Male preachers criticized Wesley, but Sarah and her friend Mary continued on. We are here in the midst of a stewardship campaign. We are asking you to discern what God is calling you to do. And in a sense, we are asking you to plan ahead. How much money to give in 2023? We're asking you how you're going to use your talents here in the church in the next year. How are you going to use your time? Planning ahead is difficult, especially when our life is in such flux these days. But I know that many of you do just that. And that for years you have committed a yearly allotment of your time and treasure. Your commitment helps your church leaders and the council and the ministry teams to make plans for the staff and programs and projects and ministries. However, there are times we need to take risk, right? At times we need to do what is necessary. And when we do take a risk, others will question our judgment. 2 weeks ago, Robin shared how God spoke to her one Sunday morning as she was sitting in worship. A message that may have startled her. A message that changed her life, however. And I'm sure that this rippling effect had a big effect on the church, how the church served our neighbors. Can you remember a time when you were called to step out and give of yourself in a way that you had not done before? Many of you, when the call came to raise money for the windows that we have back into our sanctuary, stepped up and took that risk, an unplanned risk, an unplanned ask of giving. But are there other times, perhaps, that you were nudged by God to give of your time or your effort or your money, something at the last minute? To be honest, for me, I, as a pastor, have never really done normal, I don't know what that means. I'm off script here, so we're in trouble. I have never, volunteered in ministry. My life has been so hectic, but when I was going over the questions I was asked for my assessment this year, it did ask, how does your pastor do with serving, volunteering? And I was like, whoa, I think I better do something about that. And so I've signed up. This was like nothing real planned. It was right at that moment I felt God saying, here's an opportunity. Sign up for this. And what an amazing experience. And yes, you may think I'm serving here, but there's something else about going into our neighborhoods that really changes our lives. Maybe you have felt the Spirit nudge you, and yet you responded, oh, I can't do that. Or, oh, that's not the right thing to do. What would my family think? Or, you know what, that's not in my plan. Or maybe you are wondering what you will get from that. We always think of that, I think. This past week, one of my favorite aunts passed away. Turns out that her name is Sarah as well. It was a very hard time for my cousins and nieces and nephews. We have been online chatting back and forth. And, Aunt Sarah was the type who risked all in many ways, always giving with a joyful heart, always there, not just providing a meal, but you could feel the love in the meal, reaching out to everyone. Her rule, her guidance was love. And as I reflected on her life, I thought of the quote we learned a couple of weeks ago, that St. Francis quote. Remember that when you leave this earth, you can take with you nothing that you have received. You can only take what you have given away. A full heart enriched by honest service, love, sacrifice, and courage. My aunt gave what she had, and she gave whenever there was a need. Sarah Crosby's risky move, preaching when it wasn't allowed, helped change many lives, and eventually, 10 years later, John Wesley gave women permission to preach. Preachers back then would ride horses, would go horseback. And no, fancy Ubers or anything. Sarah Crosby was quite popular and spoke to hundreds, maybe thousands of people. And once she preached to a crowd at one sitting, 600 people out in the rain. She logged her time, and at the end of 1777, for just that year, she traveled 960 miles by horse. I drive 20 minutes to get here, and sometimes I'm tired on a weekday. I can't imagine getting on a horse and getting here and then preaching. She listened to the call that God had on her heart. So how can we take risks when necessary? Well, first, make love your rule. Make love the rule of your life. And then, my friends, listen. Listen, listen, listen. And God will guide you. I loved our first song this morning. Guide my feet, Lord. May that be your song for this week. You can find it back online. You can, if you need to listen to it again. Listen, 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 and allow love to show you the way. Amen.